The camera was already rolling when Marcus walked over. He didn't ask permission. He never did. That was the whole point. The old man was sitting on a bench outside the Meridian Plaza fountain, paper cup in front of him, worn coat buttoned to the collar despite the heat, eyes fixed on nothing in particular. He looked like someone who had learned to take up as little space as possible, someone the world had spent years teaching to disappear. Marcus loved those. He had built his entire channel on that specific type of person. The ones who had no platform, no audience, no way to respond. The ones who would absorb whatever he aimed at them and have no recourse except dignity, which as far as Marcus was concerned was not a recourse at all. His comment section described it as keeping it real. His manager described it as authentic engagement content. His mother, when she still watched his videos, had stopped describing it as anything at all. He adjusted his cap, flashed the grin that 2 million subscribers had come to associate with something cruel dressed up as entertainment, and whispered to his cameraman without looking away from the target, "Don't stop rolling, whatever happens." What happened was 47 seconds of video that would be watched 14 million times before the week was over. Marcus crouched down in front of the old man, not out of respect, but to get his face in the frame. He pointed at the paper cup. He asked, in the loud, cheerful voice he used for bits, what the man's 5-year plan looked like. The crowd that had started to gather laughed. Someone filmed on their phone. A teenager pointed. The old man looked up. He didn't flinch, didn't beg, didn't look away. He just looked at Marcus the way a person looks at something they've seen 100 times and have long since stopped being surprised by. Tired, patient, completely quietly dignified in a way that had no business existing on a man sitting on a bench with a paper cup in front of him. He said, "I'm just trying to get through the day with my dignity intact." Marcus laughed, turned to camera, called him a philosopher, did a mock salute, posted the video at 11 p.m. with the caption, "Caught a philosopher in the wild." 3 laughing emojis. By 6 a.m., it had 800,000 views. By noon, it had crossed 1 million. By the time Marcus sat down to count his ad revenue that evening, still laughing about it, the video had been shared on Reddit, reposted on TikTok, picked up by 2 mid-size news aggregators, and watched, though Marcus had absolutely no way of knowing this, by a 34-year-old man in a glass-walled office on the 41st floor of a building in downtown Chicago. The 34-year-old had been eating lunch at his desk when the video auto-played. He watched the 47 seconds once. Then he watched it again. Then he set down his fork, leaned forward toward the screen, and looked at the old man's face, that tired, patient, unbroken face, with an expression his assistant would later describe as something she had never seen on him before, and hoped to never see again. Not anger, exactly. Something older than anger. Something that had been buried for a very long time, and had just been handed a reason to surface. He picked up his phone, called his assistant, gave her 3 instructions in a voice so calm it was almost frightening. "Find out who that man is. Find out where he is right now, and get me on the first flight out." His name was Daniel Rowe. He was the founder and CEO of Rowe Capital Group, one of the fastest-growing private equity firms in the country. He had been on the cover of Forbes twice. He had spoken at Davos. His assistant had once described his schedule as a mathematical impossibility that somehow keeps working. He canceled every meeting for the next 3 days, without explanation. And the old man in the video, the man Marcus Cole had crouched in front of with a camera, the man the crowd had laughed at, the man with the paper cup and the worn coat and the quiet dignity that had nowhere left to go, was his father. The flight from Chicago to Cincinnati took 51 minutes. Daniel spent every one of them staring at the video. Not at Marcus, not at the crowd. At his father's hands, specifically at the way Walter held the paper cup, with both palms wrapped around it the way he used to hold his coffee mug on Sunday mornings when Daniel was 7 years old and the world was a different place entirely. He hadn't spoken to his father in 6 years. The story of how Walter Rowe ended up on that bench was not a dramatic one. That was perhaps the most painful part. There was no single moment of collapse, no villain, no explosion you could point to and say, "There, that is where it broke." There were just 2 facts that Daniel had spent 6 years finding ways not to look at directly. His mother had gotten sick, and Walter had refused, with the particular stubbornness of a man who had built everything himself and intended to lose everything himself too, on his own terms, in his own time, to ask his son for help. "I'll handle my problems myself," he had said the last time Daniel had pushed. The words had landed like a door closing. Daniel had let it close. He had told himself it was respect, respecting his father's independence, respecting the old man's pride. He understood now, at 34,000 feet, watching the video for the 11th time on a plane somewhere over Indiana, that it had not been respect. It had been convenience. It had been easier, so much easier, to write a check to a charity he'd never visit than to sit across from his father and say the actual words. "I see what's happening to you. I am not going to let it continue." He had never said those words. And 6 years had closed over the distance between them, like water closing over a stone, and both of them had, he understood this now with a clarity that felt almost physical, both of them had stood at the surface and watched it happen and said nothing. The Meridian Plaza was 12 minutes from the airport. Daniel's driver pulled up to the fountain at 4:17 p.m. The bench was empty. He stood there for a long moment. A man in a $4,000 suit standing in front of a fountain in the afternoon heat, completely still, looking at an empty bench with an expression that had nothing to do with Forbes covers or quarterly returns or any of the uncountable things his assistant was currently trying to reach him about. He sat down. He pulled out his phone and called his assistant. "Widen the search. Shelters within 2 miles. Surrounding blocks. Food lines. Church programs, anywhere. Send me anything." He hung up, placed the phone face down on the bench beside him. He had not sat on a public bench in years. He could not remember the last time he had been anywhere without a reason to be there, without an outcome to produce, without the low, persistent hum of productivity monitoring itself. The plaza filled and emptied around him the way plazas do. Office workers moving in clusters toward the parking structures. A food cart doing steady business near the south entrance. A group of college students taking photographs near the fountain. Daniel watched none of it. His eyes stayed fixed on the far end of the plaza, on the gap between the 2 office buildings where the walkway opened up, the way a person watches a door they are not certain will ever open. It opened. Walter appeared at the far end of the plaza at 6:42 p.m. He was moving slowly, head down, hands in the pockets of the worn coat. He was thinner than Daniel remembered. His hair was fully white now, the kind of white that happens all at once when the body decides it is done pretending. He moved with the careful deliberateness of someone whose body had become a thing to be negotiated with, rather than relied upon. He was 20 meters away before he looked up. He stopped completely. For a moment, neither of them did anything. The fountain kept running. A pigeon landed on the edge of the bench, considered Daniel briefly, and left. The city moved around the 2 of them the way rivers move around stones, without acknowledgement, without adjustment, without caring in the slightest what the stone had been through to end up there. The 2 men looked at each other across the length of the plaza. Daniel noticed things he had not let himself think about in 6 years. The way his father stood, the particular set of his shoulders, the expression that was not quite readiness and not quite resignation, but something in between that Walter had always worn when he was deciding how much of himself to give a moment. The 6 years of silence sat in the evening air between them, waiting to see what they would make of it. Daniel didn't stand. He just moved over on the bench, making room. Walter spoke first. That surprised Daniel. He had rehearsed a dozen versions of this moment on the flight. What he would say, how he would start, whether he would remain seated or stand when his father arrived. He had prepared for anger, for coldness, for the kind of careful, controlled politeness that is worse than either. He had not considered the possibility that his father would simply walk up to the bench, look at him with those tired, patient eyes, and say, in the same even voice he had used to call Daniel down for dinner 25 years ago, in the house in Oakfield, "You look thin." Daniel laughed. It came out wrong, too sudden, too sharp, the laugh of a man releasing something that had been pressurized for a very long time. He pressed his hand over his mouth and looked away toward the fountain, and when he looked back, his father was still standing there with the same expression, the same quiet dignity that had survived the paper cup and the camera and 14 million strangers deciding he was a punchline. "Dad," Daniel said. That was all he managed. Walter sat down beside him. Not close. There was a foot of bench between them, the physical record of 6 years. But beside him, he set his hands on his knees and looked at the fountain and said nothing, because Walter Rowe had always understood that some silences needed to be honored before they could be broken. It was Daniel who broke it. He told his father about the video, how it had auto-played at his desk, how he'd watched it 11 times on the plane, how he'd been sitting on this bench since 4 p.m. He heard himself talking and understood, somewhere underneath the words, that he wasn't really talking about the video at all. He was talking about the house in Oakfield and the phone calls he hadn't made and the check he'd written to a charity so he could feel like a decent man without having to do the harder, more specific, more honest thing that being a decent man actually required. Walter listened without interrupting. He had always been a good listener. It was one of the things Daniel had taken so completely for granted that he had forgotten it was a quality at all, something a person could have or not have, something worth noticing. When Daniel finished, Walter was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "That young man with the camera." "Marcus," Daniel said. The name felt wrong in his mouth. He wasn't entirely wrong, you know. Daniel looked at him. "About one thing," Walter said. "I am building something." He paused, and the pause had the weight of a man choosing his words with care. "I'm just doing it slowly." He turned and looked at his son directly for the first time since sitting down. And the expression on his face was not what Daniel had spent the flight bracing himself to receive. It was not bitterness, not accusation, not the careful inventory of a man cataloging 6 years of absence and calculating what they had cost. It was something far harder to receive than any of those things. It was the look of a man who had simply kept going, who had decided somewhere in the long silence, in the smaller apartment, and the smaller one after that, and the shelter on Clement Street, that the only dignified response to the world's indifference was to refuse to become indifferent in return, who had kept both hands wrapped around a paper cup with the same quiet care he had once wrapped them around a coffee mug on Sunday mornings, because that was who he was. Because the one thing a bench and a camera and a crowd of strangers laughing could not actually take from you was who you were. Daniel felt the full weight of it arrive at once. Not the video, not the bench, not the paper cup. 6 years, all of it landing simultaneously, the way a debt arrives when you have spent too long convincing yourself it doesn't exist. "I want to fix this," he said. "You can't fix 6 years," Walter said. "I know. You can only start from where you are." "I know." Daniel looked at his father. "That's what I'm doing, right now, on this bench." Walter looked at the fountain for a long time. The plaza was almost empty. The light had turned the water gold, then amber, then the particular shade of gray that means the day is genuinely over. A shop behind them was pulling its shutters down, the metal sound of it echoing off the glass buildings, and the city was doing what it always does, moving, enormous, paying no attention whatsoever to the specific gravity of two people on a bench trying to hold something fragile between them without letting it break again. Walter put his hand on his son's shoulder. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Daniel booked 2 rooms at the Meridian Hotel that night. Not a suite, not a penthouse. 2 regular rooms, side by side on the 7th floor, because what the moment called for was not grand gestures, but proximity. The simple, entirely unglamorous fact of a door between them rather than 6 years of silence. He ordered room service. Walter ate like a man who had been pretending for a long time not to be hungry. Carefully at first, then less carefully, then with the quiet concentration of someone who has finally given themselves permission. Daniel watched and said nothing, because some things are witnessed rather than spoken. They talked until past midnight. Not about everything. Some things would take longer than one night, and both of them were old enough to know it. But about enough. About the shelter on Clement Street. About Walter's knee, which had been bad since October. About a man named Roy, who had given up his bottom bunk when the knee was at its worst, and whom Walter spoke about with the particular understated loyalty of someone who understands real generosity because they have seen enough of the imitation to know the difference. At one point, Walter asked about the company. Not to be polite. Walter had never asked questions to be polite. But because he genuinely wanted to know, with the attentive curiosity he had always brought to Daniel's life. The same curiosity Daniel had mistaken for pressure when he was younger, and now understood was simply love, with nowhere else to go. Daniel talked about the company for a while. Then he stopped and said in the middle of a sentence that he didn't actually want to talk about the company. Walter said that was fine. He meant it. That was the thing about Walter. He always meant it. They talked about other things instead. About a lake in Michigan they had visited every summer until Daniel was 12. About a dog named Porter, who had lived to 17 and deserved more column inches than he ever got. About nothing that mattered to anyone except the 2 of them, which meant it mattered completely. Daniel wrote Roy's name in his phone without explanation. Walter noticed and didn't say anything. That was how trust begins to rebuild, not in declarations but in small witnessed acts, in the accumulation of moments where a person does the right thing without requiring it to be acknowledged. 300 miles away in his apartment, Marcus Cole was having a different kind of night. He had spent the day the way he always spent days after a video performed well, checking metrics, reading the comments, tracking the arc. 17 million views, still climbing. The comment section had been shifting for 2 days, a slow tide reversal he'd noticed and told himself was manageable. Vocal minority, the usual noise. He had seen it before. Then his assistant sent him a link with no context. He opened it expecting a news article. What loaded was a photograph. It had been taken on a phone, slightly out of focus, clearly unstaged. 2 people at a hotel breakfast table, a man in an expensive suit and an old man in a worn coat, both of them looking at something just off to the right of frame, both of them in the process of almost smiling. The caption identified the man in the suit as Daniel Rowe, founder and CEO of Rowe Capital Group. The caption identified the old man as his father, Walter Rowe. Marcus stared at the photograph for a long time. He was not, by nature, a person given to reflection. His entire career had been built on the premise that thinking too carefully about what you were doing was the enemy of doing it. Speed was the strategy. Post before you overthink. Move before the moment passes. It had worked for 4 years and 2 million subscribers and a brand deal portfolio that his manager described as genuinely impressive. But he sat with the photograph. He did not think about the views or the revenue or the brand deals his manager would spend the next 2 weeks trying to salvage. He thought about 47 seconds. He thought about a paper cup held in 2 hands. He thought about a man looking directly into a camera with the patient, unbroken dignity of someone who had decided, long before Marcus arrived with his grin and his angle, that he was not going to give the world the satisfaction of making him small. He closed his laptop. He didn't post anything that night. For the first time in 4 years, Marcus Cole had nothing to say. By morning, the photograph had traveled faster than any press release. 3 of Marcus's major sponsors had quietly removed their partnership announcements. A 4th sent a formal notice of review. The comment section on the original video, which Marcus had disabled, then re-enabled, then disabled again, had resolved with the swift, brutal clarity the internet occasionally finds into something no longer split between laughter and unease. Marcus posted a formal apology 6 weeks later. Ring light, cap removed. Voice calibrated carefully to the precise frequency of sincerity. He said the experience had taught him the importance of empathy, of seeing people as full human beings rather than content opportunities. He said he had grown. He said he was committed to doing better. It received 400,000 views. The comments were not kind either. Walter moved out of the shelter on a quiet Thursday in November. Daniel had found an apartment 6 blocks from his own, close enough to be present, far enough to respect the independence his father had always needed and would always need, because that was who Walter was. And Daniel was done deciding which parts of his father were inconvenient. He had spent an afternoon furnishing it, moving slowly through the rooms with the particular attention of someone trying to get something right without making a production of getting it right. Simply. Without the kind of gestures that turn necessary help into a reminder of who needed it. He left one thing on the kitchen table before Walter arrived. A coffee mug. The same brand his father had used every Sunday morning in the house in Oakfield, back when Daniel was 7 years old and Sundays felt endless and safe, and the smell of coffee meant the world was in its right order and nothing urgent was required of anyone yet. Walter found it when he walked in. Daniel had deliberately not been there for the arrival. Some moments need space more than they need witnesses. But his neighbor Patricia, who had been asked to leave a spare key, told him later that she had heard nothing from the apartment for nearly 10 minutes after Walter went inside. Just silence. The particular silence, she said, of someone standing completely still. Then she heard the kettle. Daniel came over on Sunday morning. Walter already had coffee made when he arrived. 2 mugs on the table, the smell of it filling the apartment the way it had filled the house in Oakfield. Specific and warm and entirely itself, unchanged across 30 years, the kind of sensory detail that arrives before memory and carries memory inside it. Daniel hung his coat by the door, sat down, picked up the mug with both hands the way his father had always done. They talked about nothing important for a long time. Walter's knee, which was improving. A documentary about deep-sea fish he had watched on Wednesday and found unexpectedly moving. The way the November light came in at a different angle than any other month. Lower, more direct, less interested in flattering the things it fell on. Daniel told him about a deal that had fallen through at work, and Walter listened the way he always had, without offering solutions, without redirecting, without checking his own phone. Just listening as though what was being said mattered, and time was not a factor. Outside, the city ran at its Sunday pace. Slower, quieter, the week not yet remembering to be urgent. Daniel refilled his mug without being asked. Walter accepted it without making anything of it. At some point, Daniel looked up from his mug and realized he could not remember the last time he had sat somewhere without being aware, in some low, persistent register of his mind, of everything he was supposed to be doing instead. No metrics, no calls waiting, No version of himself performing competence for an audience. He was just in a kitchen. His father was across the table, holding his mug with both palms wrapped around it the way he always had, looking out at the November light with the expression of a man who had carried a great deal for a very long time, and had been, at last, allowed to set it down, not because the weight had disappeared, not because the years between them had been undone, or the silences retroactively filled, but because he was here, and his son was here, and the mug was the right mug, and sometimes that is enough to begin with. Walter said, without looking away from the window, "You know what I thought about, those first few weeks on the bench." Daniel waited. "I thought about that parking lot in Oakfield, when you were learning to ride the bike." Walter's mouth moved toward something that was not quite a smile, but was related to one. "You fell about 15 times. You cried about 11 of them, but you kept getting back on." He paused. "I always thought that was the best thing about you." Daniel looked at his father. He didn't say anything. Walter looked back at him across the table, across the mug, across the November light, and 6 years and everything that had happened in them. "Still is," he said quietly. "Not fixed." Daniel understood that clearly. You don't fix 6 years. You don't go back and say the words that needed saying when saying them would have cost you something real. You can only start from where you are. He picked up his coffee, met his father's eyes. Outside, the November light came through the window at its low, honest angle. The city moved quietly below. The coffee was hot, and the silence between them, for the first time in 6 years, was not the record of everything unsaid. It was just 2 people in a kitchen on a Sunday morning. It was more than enough.